let's get into actually starting our project and getting it set up. The very first thing that we want to do is make a new project in Resolve. Now, if you already have Resolve open, you can go down to the lower right-hand corner here and click on this little house, and that will bring us back to our project manager. Remember, this is where you make new projects, save old projects, export, import, do all of the managing of the project files, right? We're going to go down here to where it says new project, click on that, and it'll ask if you want to save changes. If you're working on something you actually want to save, go ahead and save. But what I have open isn't really that important, so I'll hit don't save. And for create new project, we'll call this time is money start. And let's hit create. That window will disappear and it will kind of just go back to your interface. Up here in the middle, it should say time is money start if that's what you called your project. And now this is the super intimidating blank page, right? This is the empty project where anything is possible, including terrible failure. But that's not going to be what we're doing. It's okay. The first thing that we want to do before we import our media or anything like that is set our settings. So in the lower right-hand corner next to this little house, there's a cog. That's called the project settings. Let's click on that, and that will bring up our project settings window. This is definitely worth taking a look at if you haven't before. There's quite a bit of different things to choose from, and most of it you can leave just as default. There are a couple things that we're going to change for this that are just specific to our project though. And here in the master settings, under this top part where it says timeline format, we're going to adjust a couple things. This is stuff that you need to change before you add something to the timeline, and ideally even before you really do anything, because you can change this later, but it's kind of awkward and there's some workarounds and stuff. It's just better to set it at the beginning. The footage that we're going to be using is widescreen footage, and the resolution is 1920 by 800. This is like HD when it comes to the width, but it's not as tall. And it's really not the end of the world if you do 1080 here. It's just going to letterbox everything, which just takes more processing power and everything, and it's just not really necessary. So we're going to do 1920 by 800, and everything's going to use that canvas size. For the frame rate, this is going to depend on what frame rate you shot in. We shot in 23.976, which you can argue back and forth whether it's better to shoot in 24 or 23.976. We went with 23.976 because it looks basically the same as 24 frames, and it tends to have less compatibility issues with things. So that's really all we need to change here. But again, it's worth taking a look at all the other things. A couple that I would probably take a look at are the optimized media and render cache and the working folders. Optimized media and render cache, this is basically where Resolve puts all of the files it uses to pre-render things and think about things so that it can play back well. And the defaults here are probably going to be just fine. But if you have a system that's maybe a little bit slower, doesn't have as good of hardware, you might want to choose a lower resolution for your optimized media or your proxy if this is something that you make. But generally, there are two kinds of things that are sort of like proxies. There's what Resolve calls a proxy, which is a lower resolution or easier to play back video file that you use to do your basic edit. You can play it back really nicely and it's easy to deal with. And then you can switch that out for your original media later. Or there's optimized media, which is kind of more of an automatic way that Resolve uses to kind of convert your footage to make it easier to play back. These are very similar and it's a little bit confusing. If you're all confused about this and you don't know what to use, we'll just use proxy. For media resolution, if you have kind of a slower system, I would recommend half or quarter. I'll choose half, and proxy format. There's a lot of different codecs. If you don't really know what the deal is, just hit DNX HRSQ. This is a video file that Resolve loves to play back really smoothly, and it doesn't take up as much room. And basically, the more you go up here all the way to 444, the nicer it looks. And so if you're making proxies, you don't really necessarily need those to look really nice. So DNX HRSQ is just fine, and that sounds good. The other thing I'd take a look at is the working folders. Make sure that you set all of these folders to a hard drive on your system that actually has some room. So I set mine to the D drive, which for me is just a drive that I've called cache, and all it does is just hold these files. This is just a solid state drive on my computer that has enough space to temporarily store these files from Resolve. And if you're going to build a new system, if you do a lot of video editing, I would definitely recommend something like this because you're going to write to it a lot and it just kind of optimizes your system this way. So I set all of these to that D drive. You could also just set this to a folder on your hard drive. Wherever you have room is totally fine. But sometimes what this will do is put it into C documents, videos, which isn't always the best thing to do, especially if you don't have a lot of space on your C drive. It can kind of slow down your computer. So Very important to take a look at this. Everything else here, we don't really need to pay attention to right now. Like I said, it's definitely worth going through and checking out all of these options. But for the most part, as long as we set our timeline, format, and resolution, we're going to be in good shape. So I'll go down here and hit save. And now we should have kind of this widescreen format here in our left viewer. If your screen doesn't look like this, here's a reminder just to make sure that you're on the same page as me. This is the edit page. And this is where we're going to be doing a lot of our editing. The other thing we might want to double check is go up to the upper left-hand corner of Resolve. And under here where it says DaVinci Resolve, go to Preferences. And this again is a good place to at least kind of go through and see some of the options that are available, especially media storage. Make sure that you've set that to a place that has space in case Resolve needs to write a file. There's a section for memory and GPU. Make sure that you are giving Resolve as much memory and everything as you can. I definitely recommend just opening Resolve and just working with that rather than trying to multitask and do a bunch of different apps, especially apps that use your GPU like Resolve is hungry for. And make sure that your GPU shows up here in the list. If you have the free version, you shouldn't really have very many options here. It should just use that. But if you have the paid version, the studio version of Resolve, you should have a little bit more options here and you can pick which ones you use. If you go up here to the upper part, we're on System right now. If we click on User, there's a few more options for things that we can change, like stuff with the UI, some of our default things for editing, default options for color and everything. Again, it's good just to know what's there, but we don't really need to adjust anything right now. So once we've set our project settings and everything is good, make sure to hit save. I'll just hit Control S and we're ready to import media.